The Montana wind tells stories if you know how to listen. It whispers tales of desperation, of fortunes won and lost, and of love as wild and untamed as the land itself. But in the autumn of 1888, it carried a sound that even a hardened man like Kai Reed couldn't ignore. It wasn't the howl of a coyote or the rumble of distant thunder. It was the cry of a child. What he found that day, tied to a lone cottonwood tree, would not only change his path, it would force him to confront a past he'd long since buried and fight for a future he never believed he deserved. This is the story of how a lost soul found a new reason to live, all because of a horse, a baby blanket, and a simple heart-wrenching plea. Kai Reed was a man who preferred the company of his horse, Dust Devil, to that of any human. The vast, unforgiving expanse of the Montana Territory was his sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of his past were scattered by the ceaseless wind. He was heading north, with no particular destination in mind, just a deep-seated need to keep moving. For 3 years since the fever took his Mary and their unborn child, movement was the only thing that kept the silence from consuming him. It was late afternoon, the sun a fiery orb bleeding across the western sky when he heard it. At first he dismissed it as a prairie cat, its cry thin and sharp against the low hum of the wind. But as he crested a low butte, the sound became clearer, more distinct. It was human. It was a baby. Kai pulled Dust Devil to a halt, his hand instinctively resting on the worn grip of his Colt Peacemaker. Trouble in these parts came in many forms: ambushes, desperate outlaws, territorial disputes. But a crying baby was a new and unsettling wrinkle. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowed against the glare. Below, in a small grove of cottonwood trees, huddled near a dried-up creek bed, stood a single horse. It wasn't a traveler's nag. It was a fine-looking chestnut mare, its coat gleaming even in the fading light. He nudged Dust Devil forward, his movements slow and deliberate. As he drew closer, he saw that the mare was tied to a tree with a long lead rope, allowing it to graze on the sparse patches of grass. But the source of the crying was a bundle carefully placed at the base of the tree. It was a sling fashioned from a thick, surprisingly clean baby blanket of soft blue wool. Tucked inside, red-faced and wailing with surprising vigor, was an infant. Kai dismounted his boots, sinking into the dry soil. The baby couldn't be more than a few months old, with a shock of dark hair and fists that flailed in the empty air. Pinned to the outside of the blanket by a silver clasp, shaped like a small feather, was a folded piece of paper. Kai's heart hammered against his ribs. He was a man who ran from complications, and this was the biggest complication he could imagine. His hands calloused from years of ranch work, and holding reins felt clumsy as he unpinned the note. The paper was of fine quality, not the cheap stock you'd find at a general store. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, though it trembled with what looked like haste or desperation. The message was short, the ink slightly smeared as if by a tear. Please save him. His name is not important. His life is. The mare is yours. Her name is Willow. Take him, and ride east. Do not go to Redemption Creek. God forgive me. Please. Kai read the note 3 times. Do not go to Redemption Creek. That was a problem. Redemption Creek was the only sizable town within a 2-day ride. It was his intended stop for supplies. The note was a clear warning, but the baby's cries were growing weaker, turning into hiccuping sobs. The sun was setting, and the temperature was already dropping. Leaving the child here was a death sentence. He looked around, searching for any sign of the mother. Tracks. There were plenty, but they were muddled. A single rider, it seemed, had come and gone, heading back the way Kai had come towards the treacherous Blackwood Pass. She had left in a hurry. A cold dread settled in Kai's gut. This wasn't just an unwed mother abandoning her child. This was something else. The fine horse, the quality blanket, the silver clasp, the urgent warning, it all pointed to a story with dangerous edges. He looked down at the baby. The child's deep blue eyes, wet with tears, blinked up at him. In that moment, the wall Kai had built around his heart cracked. He saw a flicker of Mary's eyes, remembered the dreams they'd had of a child of their own. A wave of profound, aching grief washed over him, followed by something he hadn't felt in years, a fierce, unbidden surge of protectiveness. "Well, kid," Kai murmured, his voice rough with disuse. "Looks like you and I are in a bit of a pickle." He gently scooped up the bundle. The baby was surprisingly heavy, warm and real in his arms. The crying subsided into a soft gurgle as the child stared up at this strange, weathered face. Kai awkwardly adjusted the sling over his own shoulder, feeling the fragile weight settle against his chest. It was a foreign, terrifying, and yet strangely right feeling. He untied the mare Willow and looked at the note again. Ride east. East was nothing. Empty plains, scattered homesteads, and the distant promise of the Dakota border. It was a fool's errand with a baby. They needed milk, clean water, a roof. They needed a town, and the only town was the one he was warned against. "Sorry, Mom," he whispered to the absent mother, "but east is a long way to nowhere." Tying Willow's reins to his own saddle horn, he mounted Dust Devil. With the baby nestled against him, a strange makeshift family of 3 rode towards the setting sun, towards the one place they were told not to go, Redemption Creek. He didn't know it then, but he wasn't just riding towards a town. He was riding straight into the heart of the very storm the child's mother had died, trying to escape. Redemption Creek sat in a valley, carved by a river that had long since dwindled to a trickle. From a distance, it looked like any other frontier town, a single dusty main street flanked by a collection of wooden buildings with false fronts. But as Kai rode closer, he felt a palpable tension in the air. The gazes that followed him were not of simple curiosity. They were laced with suspicion and weariness. The town felt like it was holding its breath. The most imposing structure wasn't the church or the saloon, but a large 2-story building at the far end of the street with a sign that read, "Blackwood Land and Cattle Co." Its shadow seemed to stretch over the entire town. Kai recalled the name from whispers on the trail. Silas Blackwood was a name synonymous with power, a man who had clawed his way to a cattle empire and ruled his domain with an iron fist. The warning in the note suddenly felt heavier. With the baby stirring against his chest, Kai's first priority was finding help. He dismounted in front of the doctor's office, a modest building with a shingle that read, "Dr. Alistair Thompson, Physician and Surgeon." The curtains in the window twitched as he approached. He knocked on the door, his heart thudding a nervous rhythm. A moment later, the door opened, not to a grizzled old doctor, but to a young woman. She was perhaps 25, with intelligent hazel eyes and light brown hair, pulled back in a practical but elegant bun. A smudge of ink was on her cheek, and she held a book in her hand, her finger marking her place. Her expression was one of polite inquiry that quickly morphed into astonishment as she took in the sight of the rough-looking drifter with a baby strapped to his chest. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady despite her surprise. I need the doctor," Kai stammered, feeling like a fool. "It's the baby. He's not sick, I don't think. But he needs things I don't have." The woman's gaze softened as she looked at the infant. She stepped aside. "My father is out on a call at the Miller homestead. He won't be back until morning. I am Emily May Thompson. Please come in." Kai stepped inside. The room served as a waiting area and was immaculately clean, smelling of antiseptic and dried herbs. Emily closed the door behind him, shutting out the prying eyes of the street. "Where did you get him?" she asked, her tone, gentle but direct, as she took the baby from Kai's awkward hold. She handled the infant with a natural, practiced ease that Kai envied. "I found him," Kai said simply, pulling the note from his pocket and handing it to her. "Tied to a tree about a day's ride west of here. There was a horse, too." Emily's eyes widened as she read the note. She looked from the elegant script to the baby, who had begun to fuss in her arms, and then back to Kai. "It specifically warns against this town, specifically." "I know," Kai said, his voice low. "But the plains are no place for a baby. He needed a doctor, a woman's touch." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "He looks healthy, thank heavens. Just hungry and in need of a change." She moved with purpose, heading into a back room. "There's fresh goat's milk on the stove, and I have some old linens we can use." For the next hour, Kai watched in silent awe as Emily worked. She was a whirlwind of quiet competence, warming milk, testing it on her wrist, fashioning a makeshift diaper, and cooing softly to the baby, who responded to her with contented gurgles. The transformation was remarkable. The red wailing creature from the plains was now a calm, fed and clean infant, dozing peacefully in a cradle Emily had pulled from a storage closet. "He's a strong one," Emily said, a small smile gracing her lips as she looked at the sleeping child. "We need to give him a name, at least for now." The note said his name wasn't important, Kai recalled. "Every soul deserves a name," she countered gently. "Finding him like that, cast out in the wilderness, but saved by a stranger. He reminds me of the story of Moses." Kai considered it. "Moses," he repeated. It felt right. "Moses it is." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. Kai, who'd spent years avoiding any semblance of domesticity, found himself feeling a strange sense of peace. "You can't stay out in the open," Emily said, her gaze turning serious. "The livery is no place for a baby, and the hotel is full of Blackwood's men. They're loud and rough." "Blackwood," Kai said, testing the name. The note writer seemed afraid of this place of him. Emily's smile vanished. She glanced towards the window, as if expecting to see a shadow fall across it. "Silas Blackwood owns this town, Mr. Reed. Kai Reed. Mr. Reed. He owns the ranch that chokes this valley, the general store, the saloon, and he holds the mortgage on nearly every homestead for 50 miles. He even owns the sheriff. People here have learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. A stranger arriving with a mysterious, well-appointed baby is going to attract the wrong kind of attention." Her words confirmed the unease he'd felt since arriving. The mother hadn't been running from poverty. She'd been running from a man. "There's a small room behind the surgery," Emily offered, making a decision. "It's not much, but it's warm and clean. You and Moses can stay there tonight. It's safer." Kai was taken aback by her trust. He was a stranger, armed and weathered, a man who looked more like a threat than a savior. "Why would you do that for me?" Emily May looked from him to the sleeping baby in the cradle. "Because my mother used to say that you don't judge a man by the dust on his coat, but by the kindness he shows to those who can't help themselves. You didn't leave him, Mr. Reed. That's enough for me." As Kai settled into the small, clean room, the weight of his decision to come to Redemption Creek pressed down on him. He had followed his gut, his protective instinct. But Emily's words echoed in his mind. He had brought this innocent child into a town ruled by a wolf, a place the baby's own mother had risked everything to avoid. He had sought refuge, but he was beginning to suspect he had walked them right into the center of the cage. The next few days fell into a strange and unexpected rhythm. Dr. Thompson returned the following morning, a kind, weary man with his daughter's intelligent eyes. After a thorough examination of Moses, he confirmed Emily's assessment the baby was perfectly healthy. He listened to Kai's story with a grave expression, his gaze lingering on the fine wool of the blanket and the silver clasp. "This is no homesteader's child," Dr. Thompson said, his voice low. "This blanket, this clasp, it speaks of money. There's only one family with that kind of money in this valley." He didn't need to say the name. Blackwood. He offered Kai work odd jobs around his property, mending a fence, chopping firewood, repairing a loose shutter. It was a pretense. Kai knew a way to allow him to stay close to Moses without raising suspicion. It also gave him a reason to stay near Emily. A quiet, unspoken partnership formed between them. Kai, a man whose hands were built for reins, and Iron found himself learning the delicate art of fatherhood under Emily's patient tutelage. He learned how to hold Moses without feeling like he would break him, how to mix the warm milk just right, and how to rock the cradle with a steady, soothing rhythm. He discovered the surprisingly powerful grip of the baby's tiny hand around his calloused finger, and the disarming, toothless grin that appeared when Kai made a low, rumbling sound in his chest. The hard shell around Kai's heart began to melt, not all at once, but in small, incremental drips. He found himself smiling a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in 3 years. He saw a different side of Emily, too. She was more than just the doctor's daughter. She was the town's unofficial teacher, holding classes for the local children in the church hall twice a week. She was a repository of knowledge, her evenings spent reading medical texts to her father or losing herself in novels by Twain and Dickens. She was fierce in her convictions, compassionate to a fault, and possessed a quiet strength that Kai found himself deeply admiring. One evening, as they sat in the surgery's main room, while Moses slept, a comfortable silence settled between them. Emily was darning a sock, the firelight catching the warm tones in her hair. "You're good with him," she said softly, not looking up from her work. "It's like you've done this before." The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The smile faded from Kai's face, replaced by the familiar shadow of his past. "My wife, Mary," he began, his voice raspy. "We were expecting a boy. We had the name picked out and everything, but the fever came through that winter. It took them both before I ever got the chance to hold him." He hadn't spoken those words aloud to anyone. Saying them now felt like lancing a wound. Emily set her sewing aside and looked at him, her hazel eyes filled with a profound empathy that wasn't pity, but understanding. "I'm so sorry, Kai. That's why I left." He continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam was broken. "Couldn't stand the quiet, the emptiness of the cabin. Been drifting ever since." "Perhaps," Emily said gently, "you weren't drifting. Perhaps you were just waiting for something to anchor you again." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He looked at the cradle where Moses slept, this tiny soul who had appeared out of nowhere and completely upended his life. He looked at Emily, whose kindness had been a balm to his wounded spirit. An anchor. For the first time, the idea of staying in one place didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a possibility. But their fragile peace was not destined to last. The next afternoon, as Kai was replacing a warped board on the doctor's porch, he saw 2 men ride up the street. One was Sheriff Brody, a portly man whose badge seemed a size too small for his chest. The other was a man Kai recognized by reputation, a lone Caleb Thorne, Silas Blackwood's foreman. Thorn was lean and wolfish, with cold, dead eyes that missed nothing. They weren't heading for the saloon or the sheriff's office. They were heading straight for the doctor's house. Kai's hand instinctively went to his hip, his fingers brushing against the butt of his Colt. Emily appeared at the door, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression calm, but her eyes wary. "Afternoon, Miss Thompson," Sheriff Brodie said, tipping his hat with a practiced laziness. Mr. Blackwood heard tell of a stranger in town, a man with a baby that ain't his. Caleb Thorne said nothing, his gaze sweeping over Kai, then landing on the front door as if he could see through it to the cradle inside. His stare was predatory. "This is Mr. Reed," Emily said, her voice betraying no fear. "He's helping my father with some repairs. As for the child, he was found abandoned and is under my father's care until we can contact the circuit judge." Thorne dismounted his spurs, jingling with a sound that grated on Kai's nerves. He walked slowly towards the porch, his eyes locking onto Kai's. "That's so Mr. Blackwood. He takes a keen interest in the welfare of folks in this valley, especially helpless little orphans. He'd like to have a word with you, Reed, about where you found this package." The way he said package made the hair on Kai's arms stand up. This wasn't a friendly welfare check. This was an interrogation. The warning from the note screamed in his mind. Do not go to Redemption Creek. He had brought Moses to the one place he shouldn't be, and now the wolves were at the door. Part 4. The Whispers of the Past. "I'm a little busy right now." Kai said, his voice deceptively calm. He didn't take his eyes off Caleb Thorne. "The doctor's paying me for a day's work, and I aim to give it to him." Thorne's lips curled into a semblance of a smile, but it didn't reach his cold eyes. "Mr. Blackwood isn't a patient man. He's at the saloon. Don't keep him waiting." It was an order, not a request. Sheriff Brodie shifted his weight nervously. "Now, Caleb, there's no need for—" "Stay out of this, Brodie," Thorne snapped without looking at him. His focus was entirely on Kai. Kai knew he was trapped. A public refusal would be seen as a challenge, and in a town controlled by Blackwood, that was a death wish. More importantly, it would put Emily and her father in danger. He laid his hammer down with deliberate slowness. "All right," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. He glanced at Emily, a silent message passing between them. "Keep Moses safe." She gave a barely perceptible nod, her face a mask of composure. The walk to the saloon was the longest 100 yards of Kai's life. He could feel Thorne's presence behind him, a predator stalking its prey. Inside the saloon was quiet for midday. The usual patrons nursed their drinks in silence, their eyes darting towards the back of the room, where Silas Blackwood sat at a corner table, holding court like a king. Blackwood was a man in his late 50s, powerfully built with a mane of silver-grey hair and a face that looked like it was carved from granite. He wore a tailored suit of fine black wool, a stark contrast to the dusty attire of everyone else in the room. He exuded an aura of absolute authority. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Kai sat the entire saloon watching them. Thorne remained standing, a silent sentinel by Blackwood's shoulder. "Mr. Reed." Blackwood began his voice, a low, gravelly rumble. "Welcome to my town. I hear you've come into possession of some lost property." "I found a baby, Mr. Blackwood, an abandoned child." Kai corrected him, his tone level. "Details," Blackwood said, steepling his fingers. "Tell me exactly where you found him, what you saw." Kai recounted the story, carefully omitting the existence of the note. He described the location, the chestnut mare, the blue blanket. He watched Blackwood's face for any flicker of recognition, but the man's expression was impassive, unreadable. "A fine mare, you say, and a quality blanket. Blackwood mused, leaning back in his chair. Sounds like someone of means fell on hard times. A tragedy. He paused, his sharp eyes, pinning Kai to his seat. And you brought the child here, to Redemption Creek. It was the closest town, Kai said. The child needed care. Commendable, Blackwood said, but the word dripped with insincerity. So commendable, in fact, that I've decided to take a personal interest. The child will need a proper guardian, a stable home. My wife and I, we've always had a heart for orphans. I'm prepared to adopt the boy. I will see to it that he is raised with every advantage. The offer was so sudden, so possessive, that it sent a chill down Kai's spine. It wasn't an offer of charity, it was a claim of ownership. That's mighty generous of you, Kai said, choosing his words carefully. But the matter is with Dr. Thompson for now, and the circuit judge will have the final say. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. The judge listens to me. The town listens to me. You would be wise to do the same, Mr. Reed. You are a drifter, a man with no roots, no name. You are in no position to care for a child. Give him to me, and I'll give you $500 and a clean trail out of this valley. Refuse. He let the word hang in the air, and you might find this valley doesn't take kindly to stubborn vagrants. The threat was clear. Kai's protective instinct roared to life. This man didn't care about Moses. He wanted him for some other reason. What that reason was, Kai didn't know, but he knew with every fiber of his being that he couldn't let Blackwood have him. The boy stays with me, Kai said, his voice quiet but firm, until the judge decides. The silence in the saloon was absolute. Caleb Thorne tensed his hand, dropping to his side. Silas Blackwood simply stared at Kai, a flicker of something surprise, anger crossing his face, before it was replaced by a cold, dismissive smile. As you wish, he said smoothly. But understand this. You have made a powerful enemy today. Enjoy your stay in Redemption Creek, Mr. Reed. I suspect it will be a short one. Kai stood up and walked out of the saloon, the weight of every pair of eyes on his back. He had drawn a line in the sand. He returned to the doctor's house to find a distraught Emily. What happened? What did he want? He wants Moses, Kai said grimly, recounting the conversation. Emily paled. Why would Silas Blackwood suddenly want to adopt a foundling? Kai paced the floor, his mind racing. It didn't make sense, unless Blackwood knew something about the baby. He stopped, his gaze falling on the blue wool blanket, which Emily had folded neatly on a chair. He picked it up, the soft fabric cool beneath his fingers. He had looked at it a dozen times, but now he examined it with new eyes. He ran his thumb over the intricate stitching along the hem, and then he found it. Tucked away in a corner, stitched in a thread so close in color to the blanket that it was almost invisible, were two small, elegant letters. CB. He showed it to Emily, whose hand flew to her mouth. CB, she whispered, her eyes wide with dawning horror. Silas Blackwood has only one child, a daughter. He sent her away to a finishing school in the East 2 years ago. We haven't seen her since. What's her name? Kai asked, though he already knew the answer. Clara, Emily breathed. Clara Blackwood. The pieces slammed into place with sickening force. The fine mare, the expensive blanket, the warning to avoid the one place her father ruled. Moses wasn't just some random orphan. He was Silas Blackwood's grandson, and his mother Clara had been running for her life. The revelation that Moses was a Blackwood changed everything. He was no longer just an abandoned baby, but the heir to the Blackwood Empire, a pawn in a game whose rules Kai and Emily were only beginning to understand. Silas Blackwood's desire to adopt the boy was not an act of charity, but a calculated move to reclaim his bloodline and control his legacy. "We have to get him out of here," Kai said, his voice urgent. "Tonight, we'll take the horses and ride east, just like the note said." "And go where Kai—" Emily countered her expression, a mixture of fear and pragmatism. "Blackwood's reach is long. His men would track us down before we made it to the Dakota border. We'd be running forever. No, we can't run. We have to find proof. Something to protect Moses. Something to expose Silas for what he is." Kai knew she was right, but the thought of staying in that town under Blackwood's watchful eye felt like sitting on a powder keg with a lit fuse. Their search for answers led them to the fringes of Redemption Creek society, to the people who lived in the shadows of Blackwood's power. Dr. Thompson, using his position as the town physician, made quiet inquiries among the ranch hands and homesteaders who owed Blackwood money. He spoke of a rumor, a ghost story almost about Clara Blackwood. She hadn't been in the East for 2 years. Whispers said she had returned nearly a year ago, not to the main ranch house, but to a small, isolated line cabin in the northern hills kept there like a prisoner. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. An elderly woman named Martha, who had served as the Blackwood family's laundress for 30 years before being dismissed for her failing eyesight, lived in a small shack at the edge of town. Emily had often brought her tinctures for her arthritis. One evening, under the cloak of darkness, they went to visit her, bringing the blue blanket with them. At first, Martha was terrified, refusing to speak. Her hands trembled as she clutched a threadbare shawl around her shoulders. "I know nothing," she repeated, her eyes darting towards the door. "Speaking of the Blackwoods brings nothing but trouble." Emily placed the blanket gently on the old woman's lap. "We just want to know about this Martha. We believe it belonged to Clara." Martha's gnarled fingers traced the soft wool, her touch reverent, her eyes clouded with cataracts filled with tears. "Her baby blanket," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I remember the day her mother, Eleanor, bought the yarn. She stitched those initials herself, right before she passed." Slowly, painfully, the story emerged. Clara Blackwood had indeed returned from the East. But she had come back, changed, defiant. She had fallen in love with a young man her father despised, Thomas Vance, the son of a small homesteader whose land Blackwood had been trying to seize for years. Their love was a secret, a rebellion against Silas's suffocating control. "He found out, of course," Martha sobbed, rocking back and forth. "Mr. Blackwood finds out everything. He forbade her from seeing Thomas. But Clara, she had her mother's spirit. She kept meeting him in secret. Then Clara discovered she was pregnant. She and Thomas made a plan to run away together to start a new life, far from her father's tyranny. But on the night they were meant to leave, Silas and his men, led by Caleb Thorne, intercepted Thomas on the road. They said it was horse thieves. Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. Said Thomas Vance fought back and got himself killed. But it was a lie. It was murder. Silas made sure his daughter would never be with the man she loved. Devastated and pregnant, Clara became her father's prisoner. He kept her hidden away at the lined cabin, intending to take the child as his own, once it was born, to raise it as a Blackwood and erase the stain of the Vance bloodline. But Clara had one loyal friend, left a young stable hand named Daniel, who had grown up with her. Daniel helped her, Martha explained. As soon as the baby was born, a little boy, she knew she couldn't let her father have him. She wrote that note, wrapped him in her own baby blanket. She gave Daniel her favorite mare, Willow, and told him to ride west and leave the baby somewhere, anywhere a stranger might find him and take him far away. She just wanted her son to be free. "What happened to Clara?" Emily asked, her voice thick with emotion. Martha's face crumpled. The birth was hard. She was weak. A fever took her 2 days later. Daniel told me when he got back. He was terrified. Silas told everyone in the valley that his daughter had died of a sudden illness while away at school. He buried an empty coffin. Kai felt a cold fury settle deep in his bones. This wasn't just about control anymore. It was about murder lies and a cruelty so profound it was almost unimaginable. Moses was the living proof of Silas Blackwood's crimes. Now he understood why Blackwood was so desperate to get his hands on the child to possess the last piece of his daughter and bury the truth forever. "And Daniel the stable hand?" Kai asked. Martha shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "He disappeared a week after he got back. Caleb Thorne told folks he'd run off with some stolen wages. But I know better. Silas Blackwood doesn't tolerate loose ends." They left Martha's shack with the terrible weight of the truth. They had no physical proof, only the testimony of a frightened old woman who could be easily silenced or dismissed. It was their word against the most powerful man in the territory. Running was still the most sensible option. But as Kai looked at Emily's determined face, he knew they weren't going to run. This was no longer just about saving Moses. It was about getting justice for Clara and Thomas and freeing an entire town from the grip of a tyrant. "He thinks I'm just a drifter," Kai said, his voice hard as steel. "He's about to find out how wrong he is." The calm before the storm was eerie. For 2 days, Blackwood made no move. The silence from the big ranch was more menacing than any open threat. Kai knew it was a strategic pause, a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He used the time to prepare. He cleaned his Colt Peacemaker and his Winchester rifle, the familiar scent of gun oil, and the cold weight of the steel, a grim comfort. He was a man who had sought to leave violence behind, but he would not shy away from it to protect his new family. Emily, meanwhile, fought with her own weapons, words, and community. She spoke quietly with some of the townsfolk she trusted, most Mr. Henderson the blacksmith, whose brother had been forced to sell his land to Blackwood for pennies on the dollar, and Mrs. Gable the baker, whose son had been beaten by Thorne's men for a perceived slight. She didn't tell them the whole story, just enough to plant seeds of doubt and shore up a quiet alliance. She reminded them of Blackwood's countless small cruelties, the slow strangulation of their town's spirit. The moment came, on the 3rd day at high noon. Kai was in the small yard behind the doctor's house, watching Moses sleep in his cradle under the shade of an old oak tree. The air was still the sun hot on his neck. Then he heard the sound of multiple horses entering town. It wasn't the slow amble of ranchers or travelers. It was the purposeful, rhythmic tread of a coming confrontation. He scooped Moses and the cradle up and carried him inside, handing the sleeping infant to Emily. "Stay in the back," he ordered, his voice low. "Bar the door and don't come out, no matter what you hear." Her eyes were filled with fear, but she nodded, clutching the cradle to her chest. "Be careful, Kai." Kai stepped out onto the front porch, his rifle in his hands. On the main street stood Silas Blackwood, mounted on a powerful black stallion. Behind him were Caleb Thorne and a dozen of his toughest ranch hands, all armed. Sheriff Brody was with them, looking pale and sick to his stomach. The street, usually bustling at this hour, was deserted. Faces peered from behind curtains from the dark doorways of shops. The entire town was watching. "Read!" Blackwood's voice boomed, echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. "I am through with games. You have my grandson. I am here to take him home." He had made his claim public. Kai knew this was a calculated move, framing him as a kidnapper. "This child is an orphan, placed under the doctor's care." Kai called back, his voice steady and clear, projecting for all the hidden townspeople to hear. You have no claim to him." "I have the only claim that matters, blood," Blackwood roared. "My daughter Clara, God rest her soul, had a child in secret before she passed. This is her son. You are a vagrant who stumbled upon him and now seeks to profit." "Sheriff, I want this man arrested for kidnapping." Sheriff Brody licked his lips, his hand hovering uncertainly over his pistol. "Now, Silas, let's just talk this through. Do your duty, man, or I'll have your badge and your job." Blackwood snarled. Kai raised his Winchester slightly. "The only one breaking the law here is you, Blackwood. You've lied to this whole valley." He took a deep breath, knowing the next words would seal his fate. "You talk of your daughter, but you don't mention her lover, Thomas Vance. You don't mention that you had him murdered because you didn't approve of him." A collective gasp rippled through the unseen audience. Blackwood's face, for the first time, lost its composure, contorting in a mask of pure fury. "Lies!" he bellowed. "Slander from a desperate thief. Is it a lie that you kept your own daughter, a prisoner in a line cabin?" Kai pressed on his voice, ringing with conviction. "Is it a lie that she died trying to save her son from you? This boy's name isn't Blackwood, it's Vance, and you'll take him over my dead body." The standoff was absolute. The tension on the street was so thick Kai could taste it. Blackwood's men shifted in their saddles, their hands on their guns. Caleb Thorne's cold eyes were locked on Kai, a killer's focus. Then something unexpected happened. The door to the blacksmith shop creaked open, and Mr. Henderson stepped out, a heavy framing hammer in his hand. He didn't say a word, just stood there watching. A moment later, the door to the bakery opened, and Mrs. Gable appeared, holding a rolling pin like a club. Then another door opened, and another. Men and women, armed with pitchforks, shovels, and old hunting rifles, stepped into the sun-drenched street. They didn't move towards Kai, but they didn't hide anymore. They stood as silent witnesses, their presence a quiet rebellion. Blackwood looked around at the faces of the people he had bullied for years, and saw not fear, but a simmering resentment that had finally boiled over. His power had always been predicated on their silence and their division. At that moment he was losing his grip. His rage zeroed in on the man who had caused this. "Thorne!" he seethed. "Kill him!" Caleb Thorne's hand blurred as it went for his gun. But Kai was ready. He had been watching Thorne's eyes. Not his hand. Kai's Colt was out of its holster in a single fluid motion. He didn't aim to kill. He fired once. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Thorne's shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own shot wild into the dirt. Thorne cried out in pain and surprise, clutching his arm. Kai's gun was now leveled directly at Silas Blackwood's chest. "It's over, Blackwood," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Your lies are done." Blackwood stared down the barrel of the gun, then at the faces of the townspeople, and finally at the wounded, useless form of his foreman. He saw the truth in their eyes. He was alone. His empire of fear had crumbled in a single afternoon. With a final venomous glare, he wrenched his horse's reins, turned and galloped out of town, his remaining men trailing uncertainly behind him. The reign of Silas Blackwood was over. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the town of Redemption Creek seemed to take its first collective breath in years. The silence left by Blackwood's departure was filled with the murmur of voices as people emerged from their shops and homes gathering in the street. They didn't cheer or celebrate, but there was a shared look of relief, of a burden lifted. Dr. Thompson came out onto the porch, his face etched with pride, and placed a hand on Kai's shoulder. "You did it, son. You gave this town its soul back." Kai looked at the faces of the people, the blacksmith, the baker, the farmers, and realized he hadn't just been fighting for Moses. He had been fighting for all of them. The door opened behind him, and Emily was there, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She didn't say a word, just walked into his arms. Kai held her tight, the solid feel of her, the scent of lavender and antiseptic from the surgery grounding him. In her embrace, he felt the last vestiges of the lonely drifter finally fall away. The days that followed were a time of healing and rebuilding. A formal deposition was taken from Martha, her voice clear and steady, now that her fear was gone. The circuit judge, free from Blackwood's influence, launched a full investigation into his affairs, including the death of Thomas Vance and the disappearance of the stable hand, Daniel. Warrants were issued, but Silas Blackwood was never found. He and the last of his loyal men had vanished into the territories, becoming a bitter ghost story told around campfires. His empire was dismantled. The Blackwood Land and Cattle Co. was broken up, its assets sold to pay off massive debts and fines. Land that had been unrightfully seized was returned to its original owners. The town, now free, began to govern itself. They elected Mr. Henderson as the new mayor. Kai, Emily, and Moses became the heart of this new community. They officially adopted the baby, giving him a new name that honored both his past and his future, Thomas Kai Reed. They called him TJ. Kai sold the mare Willow and the silver clasp, using the considerable sum to buy a small plot of land just outside of town, a place with a clear view of the mountains and a creek that ran year-round. He built a small, sturdy house with his own 2 hands, with help from the men of the town. It wasn't a lonely cabin, haunted by ghosts, but a home filled with the sounds of a baby's laughter and the warm presence of the woman he loved. One evening, a year later, Kai and Emily stood on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. TJ, now a toddler with a full head of dark, curly hair, played at their feet, chasing a grasshopper. "Do you ever miss it?" Emily asked softly. "The open trail, the freedom of moving on." Kai looked out at the vast landscape, the same kind of country he had once used to lose himself. Now it didn't look empty. It looked like a promise. He wrapped his arm around Emily's waist and pulled her close. "I spent years thinking freedom was about having no ties," he said, his voice filled with a quiet contentment he never thought possible. "I was wrong. True freedom is choosing your ties. It's choosing who you anchor your life to." He looked down at his family, at the home they had built, and at the town they had helped to save. He had come to Redemption Creek by ignoring a warning, a drifter looking for supplies. He had found something far more valuable. He had found a reason to stop running. He had found a son. He had found a love as resilient and true as the mountains themselves. He had found his redemption. 5 years had passed. The town of Redemption Creek had blossomed under the clear Montana sky, no longer stunted by the shadow of Silas Blackwood. The harsh memory of his reign had faded into a cautionary tale told to newcomers, a testament to the town's resilience. For Kai Reed, those 5 years were a lifetime. The solitary drifter was gone, replaced by a husband, a father, and a man deeply rooted in the land he now called home. Their house, once a simple cabin, now had a sturdy porch swing where he and Emily sat on warm evenings. Their son TJ was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, a boy with Kai's steady blue eyes and Clara's dark curly hair. He was the living, breathing heart of their world, a daily reminder of the miracle that had brought them all together. Kai's past was no longer a ghost that haunted him, but a quiet, settled story that had led him improbably to this perfect peace. But the past, as Kai knew all too well, has a way of sending echoes into the future. The echo arrived on a Tuesday in the form of a man on a dusty bay gelding. He wasn't a cowboy or a ranch hand. He was dressed in the sturdy clothes of a farmer, his face weathered by the sun, but his eyes clear and searching. He didn't head for the saloon, but instead made quiet inquiries at the general store, his voice soft but persistent. He was asking about the Vance family, who had once homesteaded north of the creek. News traveled fast in a town like Redemption. By the time the stranger rode his horse up the gentle slope to the Reed homestead, Kai was already waiting on the porch, his posture relaxed, but his senses on high alert. Emily stood in the doorway behind him, a hand resting on TJ's small shoulder. The man dismounted his movements, slow and deliberate. He was older than Kai, perhaps in his mid-40s, with the same strong jawline Kai had seen in the faded photograph of Thomas Vance that Martha had given them. "Mr. Reed," the man asked, his voice steady. "My name is Matthew Vance. Thomas was my younger brother." The air grew still. Kai nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "We've been expecting you," he said, though it wasn't true. They had never expected this. Matthew Vance's gaze fell upon TJ, and a wave of profound, heart-wrenching emotion washed over his face. He saw his brother's legacy standing right there, a ghost in flesh and blood. Tears welled in his eyes, and he quickly looked away, struggling for composure. "I've been searching for years," Matthew explained, his voice thick. "After my parents passed, I came west to find Thomas. All I found were whispers of his death and a story about a child. Most folks called it a rumor. But I had to know." Emily stepped forward, her expression one of deep compassion. "Please," she said softly, "come inside. Let us tell you everything." Over the next hour, they pieced together the story for him, the discovery of Moses, the cruelty of Silas Blackwood, and the town's stand for justice. Matthew listened in stunned silence, his grief for his murdered brother mingling with a dawning awe for the strangers who had saved his nephew. He looked at TJ, who was now sitting on Kai's lap, watching the newcomer with wide, curious eyes. "He has his father's smile," Matthew whispered. There was no malice in him, no sense of ownership or demand. There was only the deep, aching love of a family that had been torn apart, and that Kai realized was the new, unspoken conflict. TJ was their son, but he was a Vance by blood. He was the last of his line. That evening, after TJ was asleep, Matthew spoke of his life. He had a wife and 2 daughters on a farm in Oregon. They were a good, loving family. "We never forgot Thomas," he said, looking at Kai and Emily. "We never stopped hoping. Finding his son. It's like a piece of him has been returned to us." He paused, choosing his next words with immense care. "I would never try to take him from you. A fool could see he is loved, that this is his home. But he is Vance, too. I ask only that you let him know us. Let me be his uncle. Let him meet his cousins. Let him know the story of the father he never met, a good man who died for love." The request was a stone dropped into the calm pool of their lives. Kai looked at Emily and saw his own turmoil reflected in her eyes. Their perfect, self-contained world was being asked to expand, to let in the very past they had fought to overcome. A part of Kai, the old protective part, wanted to refuse to shield TJ from any more complications. But then he looked at his son's sleeping face. He thought of Clara, who had died, so her child could be free. He thought of Thomas, who had died for a future he never got to see. Their legacy wasn't a threat. It was a gift. TJ deserved all the love he could get. "He's your family," Kai said, his voice firm with determination. "Which makes you our family, too. You're welcome here, Matthew. Always." And so the story of Kai Reed, the lonely drifter comes to a close. But it's really a beginning. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest treasures are not sought, but found. A life adrift was given purpose by a helpless child, and a town suffocating in fear was given a chance to breathe again by the courage of a few good people. It's a story that reminds us that family isn't always about the blood you share, but about the people you choose to fight for, and that true redemption isn't about escaping your past, but building a better future right where you stand. If this story of love loss and the enduring strength of the human spirit touched your heart, please let us know. Hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales that explore the heart and soul of the American West. Thank you for listening.